I ride my bicycle at night. To me, there is nothing more freeing than the sensation that I have the world to myself and I can explore and adventure as I please. Last night, I was biking through the neighborhood of my childhood and teenage years. I was in a mood for a bit of nostalgic melancholy, I suppose. There's a road where the development ends that I called the Creepy Woods Street when I was a kid. One side has houses, the other is a train track-topped hill. The name came from before the area was expanded and it was a dirt track cutting through the woods. So I was on the former Creepy Woods area when I noticed something felt off. I felt a presence, and I can only say it felt like rot. It's hard to articulate it precisely. Around the time that I became aware of this presence, I became aware of something else. Silence. The crickets had stopped their chorus and the air seemed to keep moving, but the rustle of the trees and bushes were somehow muted. Strangely, there was a sensation that these were faded out, rather than an immediate cessation. About this time, I began to feel hunted. I guess fight or flight told me in no uncertain terms that flight was the answer, and I began to pedal like a maniac. I had the notion to not look back. I'm not sure why, but I didn't question it. When I got off the road, I felt a little bit better, but I still felt watched. It was then that I heard what a lot of folks would think is a blood-curdling scream, but I recognized it as a vixen's call. We have a ton of foxes in my area. I somehow felt drawn to it, and sure enough, as I turned off toward it, I saw her. A red vixen. This was a little unique, as I have only seen brown ones before. She regarded me a moment, and then ran off toward the Creepy Woods Street. I didn't think a lot of it, until I saw a fox at the next turn who did the same, then again at the next intersection, which was the road leading out of the neighborhood. Granted, I knew the way out, but I felt like I was being guided by them somehow, protected. All of them also dashed off after looking at me a moment, all toward the road where I felt like something was after me. I'm so curious to know what anybody else thinks. I'd like to know if anybody has any idea what the thing after me was, and why the foxes seemed to show me a safe path. It was a really cool experience, whatever it was. My stepdad was always a dry man. His humor was always what you would expect from someone born in the 1940s. He was devout in his faith as a Christian and hated superstition. It intrigued me then. In 2006 he confessed, and I say confess, because he tells his story in a tone that didn't really fit the mood of the night that he told us. We were all just eating dinner, talking about the Patriots football game. And that's when he tells me of a time that he took the train from Chicago to southern Wisconsin that stops in Kenosha. He was on the near-empty train, by himself, when he looks out the window and sees a frozen pond, very small, about 10 feet from the train. He sees about a dozen small men in green outfits. Some have top hats. Some have pointed hats of red and gold. He was shocked. It was a traditional Midwest winter, lightly snowing. He was so shocked that he shared the experience with a random woman who was sitting across from him. She noticed it too, and the both of them watched in fascination and horror. They said that they were scared, that their train cart was so empty that nobody else seemed to notice. The train began to move, and they moved on. As a teenager, you can imagine my brothers and I asking many questions. In my rational mind, I thought perhaps it was an issue of scale. Maybe it appeared that they were short little men, but he said that it was so close to the train, and the pond was so small, that there was no issue in scale or perspective. He says that he knows he saw, little gnomish men ice skating, doing acrobatics on a small little pond in the middle of winter. It's interesting because now that I'm nearly 30, my husband told me a story recently about when he was 19. He was playing Game Boy at 9 p.m. in bed, and a little man with a pointy hand was at the foot of his bed. And when he noticed him, the little man ran under the covers and disappeared. Last night, I had a really weird experience. I was laying down, ready to fall asleep, but still fully awake. My boyfriend turned on the noise machine that he has so he could fall asleep. He always does this, and it's never bothered me before. However, not too long after he turned on the machine, I started hearing a sequence of individual tunes that eventually became a melody. It's like a sound that starts and stops. First, I thought that he had changed the machine itself, or that the sound coming out of the machine was different. I asked him if he could hear the music, and he said no. He asked me what it sounded like, and he still couldn't hear it, even when he was intentionally listening for it. Then he changed the sound, and I stopped hearing the first melody. And a few minutes later, I started hearing a new one. I asked him again, and he said he couldn't hear anything. But I was hearing something completely different. This time it sounded almost like a symphony, but with very few instruments. Then he turned the machine on and off a couple of times. And finally, he told me he could hear something. He said that he could hear small pitches when the machine was on, but it was completely different from what I was hearing, as this was a third, distinct and different melody that I was hearing. He eventually turned the machine off, but I could still hear melodies all night long. I never figured out what that was. It was October 26th of 2017. It was the night before season 2 of Stranger Things came out. As a huge fan, I was super excited and decided to stay up the whole night to watch all of it. I was half awake, half asleep, watching YouTube when I started hearing a light banging noise on the downstairs window. It was almost like a bird had flown into it and was flapping its wings against it. Keep in mind, I live in a heavily wooded area, so it's not that uncommon to have animals around your house at night. I just ignored it and figured it was a bird. About 2 to 3 minutes later, I hear 3 sets of 3 bangs. Except it sounded more like a human doing it this time. I tried to listen to see if I could hear anything like talking or laughing. I hear nothing at all, like absolutely nothing. So I kind of just ignore it again. Time goes on, and again, 2 to 3 minutes later, more bangs. Except this wasn't like a bang that a human could do without tools. It sounded like the equivalent of someone banging a hammer against the side of my house. At this point, I am scared to death, and I'm thinking about calling the cops. But I decide I'm just going to wait, and if it happens one more time, I will. This time, it's at least 5 minutes before the next knocks. These were just like the last one, where it sounded like a hammer. Except this time, it was all around my house. It sounded like there were 100 people banging all at once. The speed at which the bangs were happening was just not something a human could do. At that point, I decided to run to the kitchen to grab a knife. I grabbed my dog and ran up to my room, locking the door. I calmed down for a second, and out of nowhere, my neighbor texts me, asking if I hear the banging too. So at this point, I know I'm not crazy. I decided to call 911 as the knocking was still happening. I'd say a minute later, the knocking stops, and soon after, a few cops came and searched the entire house, yard, and a decent bit of the woods. They looked on the windows and siding for any sort of handprint or any sort of proof that somebody was knocking. Absolutely nothing. Now this is the part that really gets me. Earlier that night it was raining, so the ground was quite muddy. They looked for any sort of shoe print or even an animal print. Absolutely nothing. The only prints they found were their own. Years later, about 2 weeks ago actually, I was walking through the woods grabbing my motion-activated camera to check the footage. It's about 7 p.m., so it's by no means dark, but it's starting to get a little bit. I'm a decent way into the woods at this point, when I hear this god-awful noise. I don't even know what to call it. It was like a wailing, but it was so loud. It was like oohs and ahs and screeches all mixed together. It sounded like screaming, but higher and more intense. It was horrific. No human could make a noise like that. There was absolutely no way. After that, I hopped on my ATV and gunned it home, not looking back. No joke. When I got home, I checked my phone, and the same neighbor that had asked about the knocking years earlier asked me if I had heard screaming while I was in the woods. I have absolutely no idea what this could be, but I know it was real because I wasn't the only one that heard it, and I sure as hell don't want to run into it. I wanted to share an experience that my best friend and I had about 3 to 4 years ago. I'm 17 currently, and he is 18. At the time, we were both Christian, and this experience scared the living hell out of us. I was spending the night at his house, and his mom wanted us to walk their dog before it got too late. It was around 8 to 9 at night. This wasn't the first time that we had walked around at night. In my friend's neighborhood, there's this elementary school. We would always go there and let his dog run around on the field. We arrived at the school, but we didn't feel like going on the field, so instead we decided to just walk around it. After passing the classrooms and the gym, we walked around the perimeter of the field, which has a chain link fence. I noticed that when we made a left toward the last stretch of fence, there were 2 people waiting on the curb across the street. We assumed it was just a couple out walking, but we couldn't really make them out, except for dark, human-like figures. We got a little spooked and decided to pick up the pace, not walking fast, but definitely not as slowly as we were before. I turned around, and they were following us. I whispered to my friend, and he saw them about 20 feet behind us on the corner that we had just turned. At this point, we weren't just spooked, we were pretty scared. We started to fast walk down the sidewalk. When we made it to the end of the chain link fence, about 30 feet from where I turned and whispered to my friend, we noticed that they had already made it all the way down the sidewalk before the corner we turned and first saw them at. There's no way they could have turned and made it there in time, even sprinting. My friend's dog started to whine, and we just decided to book it back to his place. This was the neighborhood he grew up in, and he knew a shortcut back to his house. The only other way to get to his home is to walk about 2 blocks on the main road. We were out of breath by the time we made it back, and we sprinted as fast as our legs could carry us. We opened his front gate, and I turned around just to see if anything was there. Lo and behold, there were 2 black, human-like figures on the main road, walking toward the house. There's no way that any people could have made it there in time, even if they did know where to go. We ran inside, locked the door, and prayed to God that nothing would happen. We Googled how to get rid of demons, prayers we could use, and so on. Nothing else happened that night. We talked to our pastor, and he told us about an experience with a demon that he had as a child. He told us to memorize certain prayers and to trust in God. Since then, I haven't really thought about it until I read some other stories. We have no idea what it was that night that followed us. All we knew was that we had to run away as fast as possible. I've seen spirits all of my life. I interact with human ones. I've seen the spirits of some of my deceased pets. But last week, I saw something different. I work more than one job, but one has a stockroom. It is on land leased from one of several local tribes. It was tribal land for centuries, before there was a highway built through the center of it, in a mountain pass. In the stock area, we have racks that can be rolled. These are called lundias. About a year ago, I confided in a friend that there were in fact some odd spirits there. My friend asked me if I had seen the ones in the stockroom. He said they were some sort of gremlin-like shadows, and that he had seen them at night. I did not see or sense any of them for a long time. When I saw some last week, I remembered his comments. They are odd. They're black, shadowy things. They're different, about 2.5 to 3 feet long. They run in the lundias, low to the ground. A former coworker asked me over 2 years ago if I had seen them running through the nearby desert. I told her I had never seen anything like them, but I have seen them now. They are hunched over at the spine, so their heads are lower than their backs. Their backs are rounded. The vertebrae are fairly well defined. They don't expect to be seen. They're sort of coyote-like, and sort of dog-like, as if they were the victims of some terrible spinal disease. They have dark fur or hair on the spine, thinning to bare skin on the bellies. Their legs are bent at the knees like dogs, in the back, and bent at the knees in the front. Their faces are dog-like with canine-style teeth. I know they have been there for many, many centuries. Some sort of nature spirits, maybe? Either way, I don't plan to bother them at all. My father's house is a creepy one. It isn't secluded, as we had many neighbors, but it was by no means in a suburb, if you get what I mean. This story is about my father's first experience, and also my first experience with the paranormal. My father is a skeptical man when it comes to the paranormal. Skeptical meaning that if something is explainable, he won't bother with it. That fact is what makes everything I'm about to tell you so much more terrifying. As he used to work graveyard shift for the school district in our town, he would sleep during the day. Back when this incident happened, we only had a cheap futon for a couch. The futon had a metal frame, with a dingy cover as the cushion portion of it, and the back of the futon, when locked up into a couch, had vertical, hollow bars. He told me that one day, while everyone was away at either work or school, he was having trouble sleeping and was awake for about an hour before being able to fall back asleep. He told me that while he was laying there trying to convince himself to sleep, he heard someone open our front door, but he never heard it close. It's a finicky door, so you have to slam it to get it actually closed. Essentially, he would have had to have heard someone close it. He had a reason to believe was his girlfriend, now ex, coming home from work early for lunch, and he thought nothing of it. While he's waiting for her to come to the bedroom, he suddenly hears heavy footsteps walk around what he believes is our living room and slowly run their fingers, theoretically, across the back of our futon. This is where the description earlier comes in. What he thought was fingers ran across the back of the futon. There's a distinct metallic thunk, thunk, thunk when someone does this. It's not mistakable for anything else in the house. It's the only object that could make that sound. He immediately thinks that it's an intruder and rushes into the living room, but no one is there. The door is wide open and nobody's anywhere in the house. I should also mention that we have a deck made of wood that has a flight of stairs leading down to the ground level. Also, the walls are paper thin. You can hear anything from one place in the house to another. I can hear my father sneeze when he's in his room while I'm in the living room. This means that he would have had to have heard, or at least seen, somebody walk out the front door and down the stairs to leave the house, and he did not. This experience had him on edge for months. He tried talking to whatever manifested in the house and taking pictures of it, just to get some sense of closure from that day. As for my encounter, when I was a teenager, my sisters and I would hang out in our bathroom to talk and whatnot. Don't ask why, it was a thing for us for some reason. One particular day, one of my sisters and I were in there talking to each other when we heard somebody sprinting down the hall. It's a very short hallway, so it didn't faze us when it stopped abruptly at the end of the hall. We were on edge, as we thought it was our younger sister and we didn't want to get in trouble. As mentioned, my father worked nights and he would be upset when woken up while sleeping. So I open the door, and as soon as I do, this huge gust of wind hits me in the face. Like, if someone's running past you. I look out into the living room and see my father's now ex sitting on the futon watching television. I asked her where my sister was, and she pointed next to her and motioned that she was sleeping. I asked if she had just heard that running, and she gave me a funny look. As my heart sank, I slowly closed the door and looked at my sister, who was frozen with fear. We both knew what it was and didn't really mention it for a while. We didn't want to make the story feel any more real than it already did. We had a few things happen in our old house. We lived there for 13 years, a mid-terraced Victorian house in the United Kingdom. My partner has 2 sons that used to come over on the weekend to stay. The youngest would never walk down the hall on the ground floor by himself to go to the toilet, because he said he didn't like it. We used to think it was just because it was a dark house. You'd have to leave the living room, walk down a hall that had a little dogleg before you got to the kitchen, and then into the bathroom. He wasn't bothered about the kitchen. It was just the hall he didn't like. That just happened all the time, and we would just moan that he wouldn't go to the toilet, but we would walk him through the hall anyway, trying to convince him that it was fine, and that it was just an old house. We also used to have our PC desk under the stairs. It was open to the hall, but it was a nifty little space to work from. I was making dinner one night and chopping something when I saw my partner pop his head round the door from my peripheral vision. I knew he was working at the PC and thought, what does he want? So I walked down to the door and asked him. He looked really confused, so I told him what had just happened. He swore that he hadn't moved from the spot. I believed him because of his reaction. I have no idea who it was, but it was the head and shoulders of a man, and it was so domestic, that's why I was positive it was my partner to start with. A few months later we were redecorating, and the stairs were boxed in with plywood. We had thought it looked pretty ugly for such an old house, so he pulled it all down. The next thing we both felt was a fresh air breeze building up. No doors or windows were open. We joked around, saying it was the spirit trying to get out, and he opened the front door and said goodbye. The weird thing was that his son started going to the toilet all by himself after that happened. He never said anything else about the hallway, and had no issues with it. We're pretty realistic and have a healthy skepticism, but that was a little bit odd. That whole place was a little bit odd. I lost my very brilliant, witty, overachieving son to opioids almost 5 years ago. He was extremely intelligent, had a high IQ, was a gifted student who graduated college in 3 years. He was self-sufficient with a great job, and had a very dark, terrible secret. He became addicted to pills in college and managed to hide it for 4 years. He didn't smoke and rarely drank. I found out about his addiction just 5 weeks before his death, and I was able to get him into treatment. He would only stay there 11 days, and I was with him at his apartment the last 6 days of his life. On November 10th, 2014, he gave me 2 red roses. He said, "Because you deserve these, Mom." And I then dropped him off at an AA meeting. But he didn't go to the meeting. He was found 45 minutes later unresponsive in a PetSmart bathroom with a needle in his arm. Since his death, and I can't remember exactly when it started, I have had roses come into my life time and time again in many different forms. I moved to Portland, the Rose City. I adopted a cat. She was already named Rosie. I decided to start photographing 2 roses which appear frequently. I swear if anybody could figure out how to reach beyond the other world, it would be my brilliant son. They appear randomly and also on important dates. His birthday, my birthday, Mother's Day. For example, on his birthday in 2016, I was at a thrift store the night before, feeling sad and like a loser really. I frequently beat myself up over losing my son the way I did. As I was leaving, I saw 2 red roses in a glass display case. It stopped me in my tracks, and as I looked at it, I saw a little note, "Pull my pin, close to you." It was a music box. As I wound it up and pulled the pin, it played "Close to You" by the Carpenters. On the day that you were born, the angels got together and decided to create a dream come true. A song about a birthday. Of course I bought it. I planted a red rose bush for my son when I moved to Portland in 2015. It has struggled and has never really produced much. Last year, in 2018, I noticed that it had 2 buds. The bush produced 2 perfect red roses, side by side, that bloomed from Mother's Day to my birthday. It produced no other flowers that year. So odd. My other roses had dozens of blooms. I have countless other signs, sometimes roses, sometimes other unexplained events that leave me wondering. At any rate, this is my story. I had a lot of creepy experiences as a child, but I never truly realized how unnatural they were until I got older. The first of many weird experiences was when I was 6. This one by far was probably the creepiest and scariest one I can recall. It was your average night. I don't remember anything from earlier that day. I was upstairs in the bathroom having just cleaned up before dinner. I opened the door to exit the bathroom into the upstairs hallway. Now, the way my house is laid out is when you exit the bathroom, you come into the small hallway. At the end of the hallway is the door to the attic, and to the right of that is my parents' master bedroom. The minute I look down the hall, I'm about to turn out the bathroom light, and that's when it happened. There was a figure at the end of the hall, in front of the attic door. It was a completely blacked out shadow person, but he looked exactly like my dad. Same height, same build, same everything, just without any discernible features or details. Except for one thing. My dad wore glasses. As I'm looking at it, this thing did as well. But the area where the clear lenses would be were completely white. They also had no discernible details except for the shape. I was thinking to myself, why would my father be upstairs? And that's when my blood ran cold, because I could hear my father yelling to my mom from downstairs. She was making dinner in the kitchen. I instantly knew that this wasn't my dad. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. It was like this thing took control over my whole body. The next thing I know, I'm walking back into the bathroom, and I rested my head on the towel rack. The only thing I can remember after that was my mother calling me from downstairs. I am now 20 years old, but I can still remember this horrifying experience vividly to this day. I have always wondered what that thing was, and why it looked like my dad.